So this is the updated photogrammetry procedure. We're just going to be taking you through the processing steps, but not showing the actual processing time. The first step is going to be to add the photos you've taken. So you go workflow, add photos. You're going to need to navigate to the file you need. We are working on 190521, right?
Yeah.
So here we go. Going to select all the photos by selecting the first one and clicking the last one while holding down Shift. Press open. At this point, the photos are going to add and they will appear here when they're done. So the next step is to import the masked out background. This is a good step to do. It isn't always necessary, but just to make the procedure simple, I'd recommend doing it every time. Have all cameras selected. In order to add the background, you're going to need to have a file name here in this row here. Unfortunately, when you click OK, it doesn't appear in the folder that you are trying to select the file from. You have to make sure your name and folder are correct. You're just going to have to trust it's in there. Okay, and now what it's going to do is it's basically going to block out all of the black background and all these images, so we'll be only left with the turntable and the silk reed itself. So once the masks have all been imported, you're going to select the first 36 photos, which should be all the photos of one sort of side of the core, and you're going to right click and select Move Cameras, New Chunk. Typically, the procedure we follow involves having a slide with the turntable without the silk reed on it, so you can tell where to cut it. Just remove that camera. You should have the background masked out. It didn't work perfectly on this one, but we actually know this model works, so we're going to just continue with it. Ideally, you just want the white line here, basically cropping the outline and removing all the black from the background. After doing that, you're going to select Workflow, Align Photos, High, and select OK. Once all the photos have been aligned, you'll ideally be left with something that looks like this. In order to check that the alignments have gone well, you can select this button here with the little camera. It's on the top bar. And you really want this sort of semi-dome, sort of like a circular wall surrounding the object. So you're going to repeat that same procedure for the other chunk. Once you have all the images aligned for both chunks, and you have two chunks looking something like this and this, the next step is going to be to create an actual mesh. And you're going to go Workflow, Build Mesh. At this step, you're producing something that isn't actually your final mesh. So depending on the material, if you can get away with using a medium quality mesh, or even, I think this is very unlikely, but a low quality mesh, it's going to greatly reduce your processing time. You just need to get meshes of high enough quality that you can actually align them to one another. One quick note, before you do this, you're going to want to make sure that the bounding box, which is this sort of gray wireframe box, is pretty much just cropping around your object. To do so, you're going to go to this region button up here, which is sort of the third one over. You're going to click Resize Region. Now you can see it very clearly. You're just going to go ahead and drag these points so that it's just cropping in your object. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I believe that the more you crop out, the less time it will take, because the less area it has to build. So this is another way you can reduce your processing time. Typically, you have to pull them from the bottom too. Okay. So when the processing is done, you'll end up with something looking like this. This is in the model shaded view. You can switch the view. You can see model solid. Wireframe can be helpful to look at because you can see imperfections much more easily here. But typically, there's nothing too wrong with it at this point. I typically don't feel the need to check. It's the next step where things can go wrong, which is you're basically going to be aligning your two built meshes. Obviously, you may have failed to crop things out when you were resizing the region. If there's stuff that you need to cut out, you're going to remove it by selecting this here You can obviously choose the way you select. I typically go with freeform selection. I'm just going to cut a tiny piece of this mesh off so you can see what happens when you do this. You will circle whatever you want to remove and it'll highlight that area. And then you simply press delete on the keyboard. In order to get something back, if you remove the wrong thing, you can always click undo. That's basically all there is to it. You really want to make sure all of the stuff like putty or just sort of extra noise that isn't going to go into your final model is removed at this point. So then you're going to click workflow, align chunks. I always try to align point-based first. What this will do is it'll take your two chunks and try to fit them together by finding like points. If it works, you'll end up with something that looks like this. If you click this layer buttons on the far right, it's going to display all your chunks. So you have something that looks like that. So you basically have your model, but it's just two chunks sort of overlaying on one another. Unfortunately, this often doesn't work. I'm just going to duplicate the chunks here to show you how to fix that if it doesn't work. Yes, okay. I'm just going to disable our two original chunks so that we don't have to worry about them. So here we have our two chunks. Now we're just going to pretend for a moment that they aligned incorrectly. Let's see if we can actually make them align incorrectly. Okay, so now our chunks are unaligned. If you run into this scenario where they just won't align no matter what you do, what you're gonna have to do is manually align them. How you're gonna do that is you're gonna start right-clicking on the chunk at points that do overlap and selecting add marker. So right now I've got the top of the F selected. You'll need 3 markers to get this process started. So 1 is top left, 2 is top right, and 3 is sort of that where the arm meets on the right. Is it not on this one? Oh, disappointing. Okay, so we're not going to use the F. Typically when photographing, it's really a good idea to try and make sure that if there's anything really descriptive, like lettering, used to like number an artifact or whatever, you try and include it in both, because it's going to save you a lot of time at this step. Luckily, I think I saw something that looked like this on the other one, so I'm going to use this. So we're going to add 3 markers to get the process started. Let's see. At this point, I'll often, if it's not something like letters, take a photo of where my markers are, just with my iPhone, so that I can find the correct. Oh, look at that. How lucky is that? Didn't know that was going to happen. I think that is the exact alignment. So we're going to go 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, right now I'm doing this kind of quickly, not perfectly accurately, because this is just a demo video. You're really going to want to try and make sure you're getting as accurately the same points as you can. Then you're going to go align chunks again, but this time you're going to select marker based rather than point based. Obviously have the chunks you want to align selected. And as you can see, now we've got them loosely aligned. If you do it this way, the next and like sort of really important step is to go through and start selecting as many points as you can. I wouldn't typically stop until you have at least sort of like 20 or something, because like, look, the alignment right now is really poor. It's just like roughly got them in the same place. The more points you add, the more closely aligned it's going to become. So, for instance, sometimes if you can't really find points as well, something you can do at this step, which can also be pretty beneficial, is building texture, because then you can actually like see things that you can't see without the texture being built. Just adding a couple points. I'm not going to go through the whole process now because, you know, there's no reason to. We have the scans ready to go, but it should have done a little bit of help. I don't want to stick quick to marker based. Okay, here we go. line chunks, marker based. Okay. And yeah, see, it's getting much better already with just a couple more markers. So you just keep doing that. I typically try and get 20 markers at least. And you want them evenly distributed along the surface of your object, because if you have, like, say, a ton on one point, and then just like a few on the rest of it, it's really going to be leaning towards aligning on that point. And since the scans aren't always perfectly the same, you can really mess yourself up with that. You want it to be aligning sort of as evenly as possible. Anyway, once you've gotten your scans aligned, the next thing you're going to do is File, File, Import Masks, but rather than from background, you're going to select from model. You're going to do this for both chunks. What this is doing basically is removing everything other than the core itself, or the section of the core you're using in the images. Once you've done that, you can go File, or Workflow, Merge Chunks, select the two chunks you want, and don't select any of these additional checks. So here's our merged chunk. And obviously we didn't merge models, so you're just left with what's called a dense cloud. This is the final step of processing besides building texture. What you're going to do now is select Workflow, Build Mesh, and here's where you actually want to get a high quality mesh. So mesh quality, high. Once that's completed, you should end with a really nice looking solid model. A way to check that everything's working correctly is go to that wireframe view and check that there's no sort of like lines floating in the middle of the chunk or anything. You really just want it to be that surface. So let's go back to model solid. You're gonna go Workflow, Build Texture, leave all these to whatever they're at, the default, and click OK. So once that's done processing, you should have something that looks textured and almost just like it was produced clearly from the photographs. This one looks really nice. If you're getting something like this, I'm not sure if this is cortex or shadow, but if it is shadow, working on how you're lighting the object before taking photos might be useful at a step like this. This is how you select the way in which you're viewing it. So if you end with something looking like this, it's very likely you just haven't selected model textured. So after doing that, you're gonna go back to your photos pane and select, I don't know, some number, a good chunk of them, and select Tools, Markers, Detect Markers, Cross Non-Coded. Okay. What this is gonna do is it's gonna try to detect the actual markers on the turntable in order to allow us to scale the object. If this fails, there is a workaround that I'll quickly discuss, but in all likelihood this is going to work, and it only really seems to fail when you're using stuff that's too small to actually include enough of the markers in all the images. So basically if you're too zoomed in, you can't see the turntable cover. So yeah, as you can see, it's picked up on a whole bunch of potential markers, but I'm only interested in the ones that are in the middle of these targets. So I know 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, and 0.8. So 5, 6, 7, 8. You're gonna go back to your reference and delete all the other points. So remove markers, remove markers. This should leave us with 4 equally placed points that are marking those markers on the turntables. Now, if this had failed and we hadn't ended with nicely placed markers on each of these targets, how you would solve this is by going through and manually adding the markers. You add markers here in the same way that you add markers on the model itself when you're aligning the chunks. So you'll just right click on the target and select add marker. The options aren't appearing right, there we go. You're gonna aim right for the center of these targets, and you need to make sure to select the targets, the same target on multiple panes. So let's say I wanted to add a marker right here. I'm gonna select add marker, and then I'm gonna go, or actually, I'm gonna find, make sure I know which image I'm on before I do this. Let's remove marker. So let's start with image 1. If I wanted to add one here on the left side of 8, add marker. I know that's 0.9 now. I'm going to go to the next image and I'm going to select the same point and select place marker 0.9. So what? Place marker 0.9. It's acting a little strange because it kind of knows where the markers are right now because it's already been scaled. Typically, you're not going to get options and it's not going to be there. There'll be like some weird dotted line shooting off into the distance. You need to know where the corresponding points are. Once you've placed the marker on more than one image, it should then position it on all of the images, or it should then at least appear when you go to the model view. Obviously, I don't actually want that point, so I'm going to remove it. The next step to scaling the image is going to be selecting points that are opposite one another. So I'm going to select 0.5 and 0.7 by control clicking on the second one. Right click, create scale bar, and you're going to do the same thing for 0.6 and 0.8. And then you have a nice little plus sign on the bottom. You're going to add the distance manually, which is 0.192 meters for our current calibration board. Obviously, it could be different depending on if things get changed. After adding the distances, you're going to click this little refresh button. It's update transform. Recenter view on the object, and there you have it. That is scaled, textured, and doesn't have any sort of abnormalities in the middle. Obviously, you're going to want to save and file, export model, title it, and put it in the folder. Typically, we've been titling final models Fin in all capitals. Since they all have the same title, it's really important you get them into the right folder. The reason we've been calling them Fin is because if the name gets too long, certain programs won't be able to load the texture files that are going to be generated as JPEGs to attach to the image so you actually get the textured image, or to attach to the scan so you actually get the textured scan. Obviously, if you want to update the naming scheme, that's totally okay, but make sure you're keeping it short. I think 5 characters is the minimum. So there you have it. That's sort of all there is to it.